May 1945. The world was a symphony of mud and rust, a landscape painted in the exhausted greys and browns of a dying empire. In a pocket of what was once the indomitable Third Reich, now a contracting wound, in the Bavarian forest, a group of women waited for the end. They were not civilians caught in the crossfire. They were the cogs and wheels of the war machine, the Wehrmachthelferinnen, female auxiliaries who had traded their youth for the stark, angular promise of a 1,000-year reality. Their reality, however, had shrunk to the space between one dripping pine and the next, to the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs, and to the chilling certainty of what was coming for them. The air, thick with the smell of damp earth and cordite, carried the growl of engines that were not their own. The Americans were close. They huddled together, a small constellation of Feldgrau uniforms softened by rain and stained with the soil of their own homeland. Among them, Ilse was a pillar of ragged defiance. Her jaw was set, her eyes, once bright with the fire of the Bund Deutscher Mädel, were now chips of slate reflecting the grim sky. She had sorted communications, patched calls from the front, her voice a calm, clipped instrument of war. She had believed. She still, in some dark, stubborn corner of her soul, tried to believe. Beside her, Greta, a former nurse's aide, simply watched, her gaze distant. She had seen too much metal pulled from too much flesh to hold on to the grand narratives of victory. She remembered the propaganda films, the leering, jazz-addled American soldiers depicted as simple-minded brutes, a degenerate race of gangsters and cowboys barely human. They were told the Americans were soft but cruel in their softness, that their victory would mean unspeakable violation, a final, brutal humiliation for the women of the Reich. This was the truth they had been fed, the gospel that had sustained them through the bombings and the retreats. They expected no quarter, for they had been taught that the concept was a weakness of a lesser people. Their capture would not be a surrender. It would be the beginning of a final personal horror, a physical and spiritual defilement at the hands of a monstrous, subhuman foe. They clutched their last shreds of dignity like a weapon, their minds a fortress built of ideological certainty, preparing for an assault that would leave nothing but ruins. The engine sounds grew louder, a mechanical heartbeat drowning out the forest's own. The end was no longer an abstract concept on a map. It was a tangible presence, and it was coming to claim them. What they could not possibly comprehend was that the real assault would not be on their bodies, but on the very foundation of their world. If you find these hidden stories of history compelling, subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the human side of conflict. The first American soldier who broke through the tree line was not the horned beast of Goebbels's imagination. He was a boy, barely 20, with a spray of freckles across his nose and an exhaustion in his eyes that mirrored their own. He held his rifle loosely, not with the aggressive posture of a conqueror, but with the weary competence of a worker at the end of a long shift. More followed, their movements uncoordinated, almost lazy, a stark contrast to the rigid, synchronized discipline of the German military machine. They fanned out, securing the small clearing with a casualness that was in itself a shock. There were no guttural shouts, no immediate violence. The air filled not with screams, but with the alien sound of men speaking in low, flat tones and the crinkle of a cellophane wrapper as one soldier unwrapped a stick of gum. Ilse watched, her body tense, waiting for the facade to drop. This had to be a trick, a psychological game to lull them into compliance before the true nature of the victor was revealed. She saw one of the Americans, a sergeant with a square jaw and tired lines around his mouth, approach their small group. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze sweeping over them. It was not a look of lust, or of hatred, but of something far more unsettling: appraisal, like a farmer assessing livestock. He gestured with his chin towards Annalise, the youngest of them, who was trembling, her face chalk white with fear and hunger. The soldier who had been chewing gum ambled over, reached into his pack, and pulled out a small, brown, rectangular bar. He held it out to her. Chocolate. The gesture hung in the air, a silent, impossible question. Annalise stared at it, uncomprehending. Ilsa's mind screamed poison. Greta saw a test, a probe for weakness. The teachings were clear. The enemy was monolithic, a singular entity of pure destructive will. This individual act of, what? Pity? Indifference? It did not compute. It was a crack in the wall of their certainty. The soldier nudged the bar forward again, his expression impatient, but not unkind. Hesitantly, Annalise took it. Her fingers, numb with cold, fumbled with the wrapper. The scent that rose from it, sweet, rich, real, was a memory from another lifetime, from a world before war had devoured all sweetness. She took a small, terrified bite, and as the flavor exploded on her tongue, she began to weep, not from fear, but from a confusion so profound it felt like grief. The other soldiers barely seemed to notice, already moving on, rounding them up for transport with a detached efficiency that was more chilling than any overt brutality. Press the like button if you appreciate stories that challenge our understanding of the past. The journey to the rear was a blur of motion and disbelief. They were loaded onto the back of a truck, the canvas flaps snapping in the wind, offering fragmented glimpses of a conquered Germany. The land looked the same stoic pines, the same slate-roofed farmhouses, but it felt alien, owned by someone else now. The American guards sat with them, rifles held across their laps, their faces placid. They smoked cigarettes, sharing them amongst themselves, the smoke a pale ghost in the damp air. No one spoke to the women. No one touched them. They were simply cargo, an administrative problem to be moved from one point on a map to another. This profound lack of interest was the second shock. They had been prepared for hatred, for rage, for lust. They were not prepared to be ignored. Their destination was a temporary processing center, a hastily erected city of tents and barbed wire on the outskirts of a French town. Here, the American system revealed itself in its full, terrifying scale. It was a machine, but not of the kind they knew. The German war machine was built on ideological fervor and ruthless sacrifice. This American machine seemed to be built on paperwork and logistics. They were led into a large tent where they were stripped of their uniforms and meager possessions. This, Ilsa thought, is where it begins. But instead of violation, they were met with a team of female medics who dusted them with delousing powder, their touch firm and impersonal. They were showered in stalls with warm water and harsh soap, a luxury none of them had known for months. They were issued new clothing, shapeless, grey shifts and rough clogs. And then they were fed. Not the thin, watery soup of the collapsing front, but a hot stew with real meat and vegetables, served in a metal tray with a slice of white bread. The bread was soft and airy, an impossible substance. Ilsa ate mechanically, her mind reeling. Every mouthful was a contradiction. Every act of routine, non-violent processing was an ideological dagger. Their propaganda had insisted the Americans were a nation of decadent capitalists who lacked the Spartan will to wage total war. But here was the evidence of their power. It was not in the fury of their soldiers, but in the sheer, overwhelming abundance of their supply lines. They had so much food, so much soap, so much fuel, so much everything that they could afford to treat their prisoners not with cruelty, but with the casual, almost insulting efficiency of a well-run factory. This wasn't mercy. It was something far more devastating. It was a demonstration of a power so vast it had no need for petty cruelty. What part of this story surprises you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The days bled into one another, each one a relentless assault of structured, humane boredom. The camp was a world unto itself, governed by rules that were strict but logical. There were roll calls, work details, laundry, kitchen duty, and long hours of enforced idleness. The guards were a rotating cast of young men who seemed to view their duty as a tedious chore. They were not the Aryan supermen of German newsreels, nor were they the drooling monsters of the party's warnings. They were loud, they were informal, they slouched. They called their officers by their first names when they thought no one was listening. They complained about the food that to the German women was a feast. This lack of rigid hierarchy, this casual familiarity, was as jarring as the material abundance. Greta became a quiet observer of this alien culture. She watched them play baseball in the evenings, a game of baffling complexity and childish enthusiasm. They would argue over plays with a passion they never displayed on guard duty. They listened to music on crackling radios, songs that were loose-limbed and sorrowful, and entirely without the martial, percussive force of German marching anthems. She saw them receive letters from home and witnessed their faces soften, their carefully constructed military bearing dissolving into the unguarded expressions of sons and brothers. One afternoon, she saw a young guard, a boy from Ohio with a face like an open book, weeping silently over a photograph. He made no effort to hide his tears. This display of vulnerability in a uniformed soldier was unthinkable. In the world they came from, a soldier's tears were a source of profound shame, a crack in the armor of the state. Here it was just a man missing his family. Ilse resisted this creeping humanity. She sought out evidence of their corruption, of their weakness. She interpreted their kindness as a sophisticated form of psychological warfare, designed to break their will more completely than any torture. She told herself their abundance was a hollow shell, a product of a soulless consumerism that lacked the spiritual depth of the German Volk. But her arguments grew thin, even to her own ears, as she watched the daily reality of the camp unfold. She saw a medic spend an hour patiently cleaning and dressing a festering wound on the leg of an older woman, speaking to her in broken German, his voice gentle. She saw the camp commander refuse to cut rations when a supply truck was delayed, instead sourcing food from a nearby army depot. These were not the actions of a weak or decadent people. They were the actions of a people for whom logistics and human welfare were intertwined, a problem to be solved with resources, not rhetoric. The cognitive dissonance was becoming a physical weight, a constant pressure behind her eyes. The world as she knew it was built on a foundation of necessary cruelty, of strength defined by the willingness to inflict and endure suffering. The American reality suggested a different, terrifying paradigm, that true strength might lie in the ability to create a system so powerful and so efficient that it made cruelty unnecessary. These moments of unexpected humanity are often lost in the grand narratives of war. Help us bring them to light by sharing this video with someone who appreciates history. The real war was now being fought inside their own minds. The physical defeat was absolute, a fact as solid as the barbed wire fence. But the ideological defeat was a slow, creeping poison. Each day brought fresh evidence that chipped away at the granite edifice of their worldview. It was in the small things, the relentless accumulation of details, that contradicted a decade of indoctrination. It was in the way the American quartermaster accounted for every blanket and every tin of beans, a level of bureaucratic organization that seemed almost comical until they realized it was the very engine of their victory. It was in the casual way the GIs would speak of the future, of going home, of college, of buying a car, a future that they assumed, with an unshakable certainty, would be there for them. For the German women, the future had been a collective project, a grand historical destiny. For the Americans, it seemed to be a personal one, a collection of individual dreams and aspirations. This revelation was profoundly unsettling. Anneliese, who had once dreamed of being a mother for the Reich, now found herself listening to the guards talk about their girlfriends back home, their simple, mundane plans for a life of peace and quiet. The contrast between the apocalyptic, grandiose vision of her own culture and the humble, domestic aspirations of her captors was a chasm she could not bridge. She felt a strange, bitter envy. They had been taught to despise this bourgeois sentimentality, but in the quiet of the barracks at night it sounded like salvation. Ilse fought the hardest. She would get into whispered, furious arguments with Greta, accusing her of succumbing to enemy propaganda. She pointed to the occasional instances of callousness or cruelty from a guard as proof of their true nature. But these were exceptions, isolated acts of individual malice, not the systemic, state-sanctioned brutality she had been led to expect. The system itself was designed to be humane, or at the very least efficient and impartial. She began to compare. She remembered the stories from the Eastern Front of German soldiers freezing to death in summer uniforms because the logistics had failed. She remembered the brutal hierarchies within their own camps, the casual cruelty of the powerful towards the weak. She remembered the constant gnawing hunger, the rationing, the ersatz everything. The German war effort, for all its rhetoric of superior will and organization, had been a chaotic, desperate scramble. The Americans, by contrast, seemed to wage war as an industrial process. They did not appear to hate their enemies with the same fervent, all-consuming passion. They were there to do a job, and they brought all the necessary tools to do it, including the seemingly unnecessary tool of humane prisoner treatment. It was this realization that finally began to break through Ilse's defenses. The respect they were shown was not born of weakness or sentimentality. It was a byproduct of their power. It was the ultimate luxury of a nation so strong it didn't need to be cruel. The psychological weight of this understanding was immense. It meant their suffering, their sacrifices, their belief in their own inherent superiority. It was all for nothing. They had been defeated not by a better army, but by a better system. What do you think is more powerful in war, ideological fervor or logistical superiority? Let us know in the comments. As the summer of 1945 deepened, the reality of Germany's utter collapse became undeniable. News, once a tightly controlled stream of propaganda, now flowed into the camp in a torrent of shocking truths. Photographs from the liberated concentration camps circulated, images of skeletal figures and piles of bodies that defied comprehension. The women looked at them in stunned silence. Some refused to believe, calling them clever forgeries. Others felt a sickening lurch in the pit of their stomachs, a sense that the world was even darker than they had imagined. This was the Reich they had served. This was the end result of the ideology that had demanded their total devotion. The moral certitude that had once been their armor was now shattered, leaving them naked and ashamed. The dynamic in the camp began to change. The war was over. The GIs were no longer captors in a combat zone. They were administrators of a defeated population. The formal distance began to erode in places. Some of the women, particularly the younger ones, began to tentatively interact with the guards, practicing their broken English, trading questions about their lives. It was not fraternization in a romantic sense, but a simple human curiosity. They were trying to understand the people who had so comprehensively defeated them. They learned about places like Iowa and Texas, about high school dances and corner drugstores. It was a vision of a world so peaceful, so normal it felt like a fantasy. Ilse watched these interactions with a mixture of contempt and despair. She saw it as a final, pathetic surrender. But even she could not deny the pull of this new reality. One evening, a makeshift movie screen was erected in the camp, and they were shown a Hollywood film. It was a musical, a dizzying spectacle of color and sound, of impossibly beautiful people dancing in luxurious settings. For the women who had lived in a world of grey uniforms and concrete bunkers, it was an overwhelming sensory experience. The film was frivolous, silly, and utterly without any ideological message. And that was its power. It depicted a world where happiness was not a duty to the state, but a personal pursuit. It was the most effective piece of propaganda they had ever seen, precisely because it did not feel like propaganda at all. It was simply a window into a reality they had been taught to despise, but which now looked irresistibly, painfully bright. The foundation of their world was not just cracked, it was dissolving into dust, replaced by something they had no words for. History is full of these moments where one culture is completely overwhelmed by another. Subscribe and hit the bell icon to be notified when we release our next video exploring these fascinating encounters. The climax of their psychological unraveling did not come with a bang, but with a whisper. It arrived in the form of a rumor, a piece of news that traveled through the barracks like a contagion. As the Allied authorities began the long, complex process of sorting prisoners for repatriation or potential war crimes trials, information from other camps began to filter through. A group of female auxiliaries captured in the north, who had been held in a similar camp, were the subject of the story. The details were sparse at first, then shockingly specific. It was said that some of these women were not being repatriated. They were staying, they were getting married. The rumor crystallized around a single, impossible number, 7. 7 women, former signal operators and clerks for the Wehrmacht, had officially petitioned to marry American soldiers, 7 couples born from the ashes of a world war. The news was met with stunned silence, then a wave of frantic, disbelieving whispers. It couldn't be true. It was a lie, a cruel joke. Ilse denounced it as a fabrication designed to break their spirit, a final, perverse insult. But then a new group of prisoners was transferred to their camp, and among them was a woman who had been at that northern facility. She confirmed it. She had known one of the girls. The paperwork was being processed. The army chaplains were involved. It was real. The number 7 became a symbol, a focal point for all their confusion and despair. It was no longer about a few isolated acts of kindness or the shocking abundance of the American military. This was something else entirely. This was the ultimate ideological surrender. Their culture, their nation, their entire worldview was predicated on a myth of racial purity and the unbridgeable chasm between them and their enemies. To marry the enemy was not just a personal choice, it was a profound act of treason against the very idea of their people. And yet it had happened, not once as a strange anomaly, but 7 times, a pattern, a statement. For Ilse, the news was a physical blow. She finally understood. The Americans had not just conquered their cities and destroyed their armies, they had won in a way the strategists in Berlin could never have conceived. They had not defeated Germany with bombs and bullets alone, but with chocolate bars, warm blankets, Hollywood movies, and the disarming revolutionary promise of a normal life. The respectful treatment they had received was not a tactic. It was an advertisement. It was the natural expression of a system so confident in its own appeal that it could absorb its enemies not by force, but by seduction. The The 7 marriages were not a sign of the women's weakness. They were a symbol of the terrifying, irresistible strength of the American way of life. The war for their souls was over, and they had lost. This moment of realization is a powerful turning point. If this story is resonating with you, please hit the like button to help it reach more viewers. The journey home was an inversion of their journey into captivity. They were transported in cattle cars, not trucks, herded by grim-faced officials from their own shattered nation. They crossed back into a Germany that was a ghost of the country they had left. The cities were skeletal ruins, the people were gaunt spectres with hollow eyes. Here, in their supposed freedom, they found the hunger, the cruelty, and the desperation they had been spared in the POW camp. The victors had fed them while their own people now starved. The irony was a bitter acid in their throats. They had returned from the enemy's embrace to a homeland that was a landscape of shame and destitution. They tried to speak of their experiences to explain the profound shock they had undergone, but no one wanted to listen. To their families and neighbors who had only known the Americans as the crews of the bombers that had incinerated their cities, their stories were incomprehensible, even treasonous. How could they speak of the enemy's kindness to a mother whose children had been buried in the rubble of Dresden? How could they describe the abundance of the American camps to a father scavenging for potato peels? Their truth was an isolating, private burden. They were caught between 2 worlds belonging to neither. They were no longer the proud daughters of the Reich, but they could never be part of the world that had defeated them. The memory of the camp became a secret touchstone, a complex and troubling legacy. It was not a happy memory, for it was inextricably linked to their nation's humiliation and the collapse of their own identities, but it was a formative one. It had taught them a lesson more profound than any they had learned in their state-sanctioned education, that ideologies are fragile things and that the grand narratives of history can be dismantled by a single, unexpected act of human decency, multiplied by the relentless efficiency of a well-supplied system. They had seen firsthand that a society's strength is not measured by its capacity for cruelty, but perhaps by its ability to render cruelty obsolete. For the rest of their lives, the women who survived that camp carried this knowledge within them. The story of the 7 marriages became a kind of quiet legend, a testament to the fact that the most decisive battles are not always fought on the battlefield. They are fought in the minds of the vanquished, in the silent, terrifying moment when they look upon their conqueror and see not a monster but a mirror to their own broken world.